Well, hello everybody, good afternoon. Once again, here we are. I'm in Madrid this time, actually. Welcome to everybody to this seminar. We have a very special guest with us today. I would like to introduce Ali Marie Diamond. She's from New Zealand and she's here with us today. We have to actually be particularly grateful to Ali Marie because in Australia it's 2 a.m. right now. 2 a.m. on Friday, the 28th of April. So thank you so much, Ali Marie, for being here with us at 2 a.m. We hope to keep you awake at least. I hope we will have a very enjoyable discussion today together, and we're really looking forward to learning all about this New Zealand model and how the prostitution system works over there, where it is completely decriminalized. I would like to just offer a brief introduction. Ali Marie actually was in Spain last year, so we met her in person. She was here supporting a very important campaign carried out by the abolitionist movement, the CAP, the coalition, and Ali Marie and her organization are actually a part of that. And as are we, the Abolitionist School and feminicidio.net. Ali Marie's testimony was really key. This all happened in mid-June last year. There were 8 survivors there present, all with a very international profile. And the survivors were asking the government of Spain not to support a law which was on the verge of being passed, or rather to support this draft law, which would be to criminalize pimping. We think this is a very abolitionist law in nature. There were 2 MPs there, one Andrea Fernandez from the Socialist Party, and at this meeting they said that this draft law would be passed last November. When November came along, it wasn't passed, but not only that, but the trans law was pushed forward. Now, here we are very clear that the global feminist movement and the Spanish movement as well should have as its priority achieve abolitionist laws in those countries where this model is not recognized as yet. Because of this trans law, it delayed the pimp law, which was then supposed to be passed in February, which still hasn't happened. Unfortunately, this government is coming to the end of its term soon, and we're worried that this law may not be passed. We've been waiting decades for this law in the abolitionist movement. So, what I would love today is for you to talk to us about this New Zealand model. A couple of weeks ago, Human Rights Watch presented a letter to the Congress of Deputies which asked for this law not to be passed. They said that just in summary, it was a very long letter, but they stated in this letter that it went against women's rights. And they suggested rather the New Zealand model of total decriminalization and the protection of sex workers' rights. So this is what's going on right now. And with this background, I think now is the time to hear your story, to listen to you talk to us about all of the lies about this New Zealand model and all of the propaganda that is going on. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about how this model has affected you and what is happening there. So I'm going to first of all introduce you. Well, Ali Marie Diamond is a feminist from New Zealand, and she co-founded Wahine Toa Rising, excuse my pronunciation. It's a survivor-led movement which helps women, girls and boys exploited in prostitution in Aotearoa. Apologies again for my pronunciation. This is how we say New Zealand in the native language. So Ali Marie has mixed ethnicity from Pacifica and Maori. We'd love to actually hear more about the differences there and about where you have your roots. Ali Marie is a very learned person, a great voice for the abolitionist movement in New Zealand and Australia. I understand you live in Australia right now. New Zealand, as a reminder, decriminalized prostitution in 2003, so 20 years ago. So without further ado, I will give you the floor, Ali Marie. We have 800 people signed up to this seminar, and 400 usually are able to log on to the meeting. So thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your story with us. Whenever you're ready.
A lot of people. My name is Ali Marie Diamond, and I'm a co-founder of Wahine Toa Rising. I'm going to answer Graciella's question quickly. My father's side is Samoan, so in the Polynesian Islands, and also Maori. And then my mother's side is actually European. So I think Southend-on-Sea in England is where my family originate from on my mother's side. Tonight, I'm actually going to share with you some of my personal story in the sex trade. And then I'm going to go on to explain why full decriminalisation is not working in New Zealand and why it's actually causing more harm than good for our women and children. So thank you very much for having me here tonight, and big thank you to the interpreters as well for making this possible. I vividly remember one particular night. As silent as a thief, he entered my room, my bed. I was 5. I remember being so terrified that I couldn't move or scream. No sound left my lips. I froze, too scared to even shed a tear. My fragile little body felt like I had bugs crawling all over me. Yet they were not bugs. They were my uncle's tongue working its way up from my body, from the tips of my toes to the top of my head. I whimpered ever so softly, his hand now placed over my mouth, while he whispered in my ear, "No one will believe you." How sad that I instantly knew, even at that very young age, that he was right. No one would believe me. I knew that I was different even then. I was an olive child in a white family. I was an outcast, or as my grandmother's ministry called me, a half-caste child. I was 3 when my head was pushed down over an older boy's penis. Already it was becoming ingrained in my young brain that this behavior was normal and that it was accepted. Sitting in the playground with my only friend at school, who was also a half-caste child, The other children would hurtle names at us like spears piercing through our hearts. Names like smelly, half-caste, stinky. Questions like, don't you know how to wash yourself? Or are you that poor you can't afford the soap because you're still brown and you're dirty? Maybe you should need to scrub harder so you'll become white. I remember walking through my schoolyard alone, boys as young as 9 asking me to pull my knickers down, popular boys. And oh, I was so desperate to be accepted that I complied, because after all, men had been taking my undies off since I was 3. So this was normal, right? But all it would bring was more teasing, more name calling as word got around that I was easy, that I put out. And if I said no, they would push me around. The girls would tease me. They would steal my bike, throw stones at me. I hated school. I hated being there. And no one heard my cries. No one helped me. No one was there for me. I felt so bad that I couldn't lift my head. I would walk staring at the ground. Words like no hoper, loser, liar, ugly, engraved so deep into my soul that even to this day, I'm still trying to stand them out. The sneaky thieves that came in the night, well, they just kept on coming. So many I had lost count. My grandparents, you see, belonged to a church where sexual abuse, rape, and assault on young girls and boys seemed to be an epidemic. But as a still very young girl, I didn't understand. I knew it didn't feel good, but I still felt it was normal. I quickly learned that the only thing that men wanted from me was sex. I was a young woman when my baby girl was taken away from me, as my adopted parents and the church they belonged to didn't believe in a single coloured woman raising a white child. You see, my baby girl was fair, with bouncy blonde curly hair and the fairest skin. She was quite the opposite to me. At this time, I was already in huge debt. Budgeting was not a skill set I had acquired. And to be honest, my relationship with money was as bad as the violent relationships that I had found myself in growing up. I was pretty much homeless, alone, and terrified of life and my existence and the world around me. I had nothing. My baby girl was gone. The church that my family belonged to, ordering that no further contact with me was to be made. The only friends I had ever known were now just a memory as every door closed shut and was locked behind me. I was alone and I was on my own. It was at this time that a friend would approach me about a way out, a way to pay my debts and have somewhere to sleep, have support that I needed to move out of the place that I was in. This is when my journey into the world of prostitution began. It was 1993 and I was 21 years old. It began in a small residential house in a classy, quiet suburb on the outskirts of Auckland. As I walked to the front of the house, I had to check I had the right number, as it looked like every other house on the block. No red light out the front, as I'd always imagined. Just a quiet off-white weatherboard home with a picket fence, driveway, and a letterbox. It looked like all the other houses and it was quiet. It was run by a man of Asian descent who seemed to be quite caring and nice, I thought. When I began that first night, I was in high demand, new to the scene, quiet, vulnerable, timid, petite, pretty, and extremely naive. However, I wasn't there for long because the manager explained he was taking me to the city to meet a friend. He said I would be taken better care of, looked after, protected, and I could live in the brothel and earn money. The entrance to the massage parlour on the right beneath the La Cherie sign. It was a massage parlour in a very quiet street in the middle of the city, but amongst seedy adult video stores. It wouldn't be long before I found out exactly what went on behind those closed doors. The entry to the massage parlour was lit up by the light shining from the inside and the flashing name sign outside the door, La Cherie. Inside, there was a long, straight, narrow stairwell. The stairs were covered in red carpet, and as I took my first step, I noticed they were worn and dirty like they'd never been cleaned. Walking up the stairs behind the Asian man who had brought me, my head hung low. I was scared, ashamed, embarrassed. My gut was telling me to run, to turn around and run fast. Who would I run to? I had nowhere to go. I was alone. Feeling faint and woozy, I reached out to the wall to get my balance. The pink cream coloured paint was peeling off the walls. I pulled my hand back quickly and a lump began to form in my throat. There was a distinct smell in the air that I would later recognise as stale cum mixed with rubber and dust. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed there were more stairs that led to another level. I was ushered through the door of the level we were on, and in front of me was a huge desk, a long, black, glossy reception desk. Sitting behind it was a man who was introduced to me as the receptionist. As he looked at me almost like a hungry wolf, another older gentleman walked in. He looked seedy, his large silver chain around his neck, glistening as bright as the sweat on his chest hairs that showed through his unbuttoned white shirt. This was the manager. The receptionist had girls draped all over him. His crisp, light blue shirt was slightly undone. He wore tight black jeans, and as he leaned back in the high-backed black leather chair, his creepy grin gave me the chills. Cold, freezing chills that I still can't get out of my head even today. I was ushered into another room that was dark, except for a lamp in the corner that released the slightest golden glow. As my eyes adjusted, I could see that there were a lot of girls sitting around. Most were Thai, Pacific Islander, and Maori. The Thai girls were very young and petite, and I soon learnt that they didn't speak English apart from a few basic words. There were a couple of blonde girls, one tall and busty, and another who was heavily pregnant and didn't look any more than 16. This room would become my second home. This is where I would spend most of my days and nights. This first night, the manager asked me to sit out at reception. He wanted all the men to see me as I came up those stairs and through the main door. You see, I was the big money maker that night, the virgin to the city, untouched, vulnerable, and naive to the life that was about to follow. I was soon to learn that those who walked up those stairs would pay big money for the virgin of the streets, even putting in bids to management to be the first when a new girl arrived. They wanted to be the first one to break her in. My very first client that night was a man that I will never forget. He haunts my sleep, my dreams, and sometimes my waking hours. They say you never forget your first, and it seems I will never forget many firsts, including this one. He was obese and sweaty. As we walked in the room and he got undressed and stepped into the shower, I had to stop myself from gagging. The smell, the sweaty, crusty stench from the dried up sweat in his fat rolls filled my nostrils. And as I took a deep breath in, I could feel my stomach contents hit the bottom of my throat. It was a rule we had to shower with them. And as I stepped into the small corner shower of the room, I could feel his sweat against my skin. Even just writing this and speaking about it, I can still feel his hairs from his belly against my goosebump skin. They felt like prickles. I shuddered, trying to just get through. As I washed him down with bar soap, the smell of crusty sweat became worse. Crazy as it was mixed with soap, that foul odor intensified rather than disappeared. After he was out of the shower, I dried him off. But no matter how much I tried to dry him, he just seemed to stay damp. As he laid on the bed waiting for the body slide, another thing we were ordered to do, a body slide where you massage oil on their bodies and slide your own naked body along them. But for this man, it was not good enough. He was so drunk and incoherent, his penis disappearing under his belly, that no matter what I did, nothing was happening for him. So with his anger and his frustration, he picked me up and he threw me across the room, yelling that I was nothing but a useless black bitch, a dumb whore who couldn't get him hard. He slapped me with so much force that the sting on my skin brought me to tears, but I fought them back, trying not to show any weakness. I was used to being beaten, but not like this. This was different. There was a different anger in men who didn't get their way sexually. This was my first experience of violence and prostitution, but it was definitely not the last. More than 20 men were brought to me that first night, one man after another over a period of 24 hours. No money passed through my hands. It was all paid to the receptionist beforehand, all inclusive. That first night, I was beaten and forcefully sodomized while being told by a white, socially respected man that that was all I was worth, that I should be grateful he was paying me. Men would try and stick their entire fists into my vagina and then get angry because I was too tight. Yet an hour before, another man would be whining that I was too loose because he was so drunk, his penis had shrunk and disappeared into his body. Not that any man cared, because they had paid for the right to rape, sodomize, degrade, beat, and abuse me. And this was just how I thought all men treated women. So it was better that I get paid to be raped and beaten than just be raped and beaten, I reasoned. After that first night, the manager gave me one of the rooms I had used to sleep in. He didn't want me to go far in case he needed me to wake up for work. Unbeknown to me at the time, I would never leave that brothel or see the light of day again for years. After that last man left, I curled up on my bed, tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. My body hurt so bad. I was bruised, broken, my nipples were cracked and bleeding, and as I looked down at my breasts and at my body, I didn't recognize myself. My vagina was burning like it was on fire. My bottom was so cracked and so torn that my sheets were covered in blood. I felt ashamed, alone, afraid, broken, and worthless. All the years I'd been abused as a child did not even compare to this. It was worse, so much worse. I don't even remember falling asleep that night, but I do remember waking up and realizing that this wasn't a nightmare. This was now my reality. There were 6 rooms down that dark, seedy hallway, each fitted out with emergency buttons, showers, and a bed. All the rooms had old carpets and peeling walls, and that distinct smell that would eventually become normal and less nauseating. The buzzers hardly got used. There was never any time. And if we did press them, well, no one would come. The nights would now start to pass in a blur, and I would become a robot. As money flowed in, most of it went to the manager for living expenses, as he called it. What was left, I spent on new clothes, shoes, lingerie, as I tried to fit into this life and feel like I belonged somewhere and that I was worth something. See, I was popular then. I was wanted, but not in a healthy way. I didn't know any better. Funny how I felt like a princess. There was no limit to what I could buy, but then there was no trade-off really. Because even though I bought the things that I'd always dreamed of, it never covered the feelings of uselessness and worthlessness. My entire life, I had been sexually, emotionally, and physically abused. The life of abuse was all that I knew. the only normal I knew. So for me, it felt comfortable in a weird way. Attention came not just from clients, but from everywhere. Bouncers, bar managers, men. And I loved it, but it was not healthy. I craved any kind of attention. I craved acknowledgement, no matter what form that took. Spreading my legs was now a habit. It was an addiction. And before I knew it, I was in so deep that I couldn't see a way out. It was like being lost in the darkest of forests where the sun never shone. But like any addiction, it is not long before that high wears off. And I started drinking to numb the pain, the shame, the life. And when that didn't work anymore, I turned to drugs. As my popularity dwindled, the violence and the abuse from the men around me got worse. I would be locked in my room and would only be let out to see clients. I was watched constantly and they knew my every move. Before long, I found a light within me and I started to use my voice. But this was met with more abuse as they fought to regain control and keep me quiet. I'm grateful I'm alive to be here with you all and share a part of me that haunts me to this very day. I'm grateful I found my voice, but some are not so lucky. One of those being my sister, not biologically, but spiritually. You see, I met her on the street when she was broken, 14 and pregnant. She stayed on those streets in New Zealand until 2010. We still remain close, but as I learned to heal, she still drinks every day to forget, to block out those feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, and shame. Every now and then she'll return to the only place she knows, because as she says, even though the streets destroyed her, she doesn't know any other way. This for her is her normal. The abuse that went on behind those closed doors scared me, but I never reported it or told anyone for fear of what would happen to me if I did. Men would see me in as object that they could do anything they liked with, anything they had seen in the latest porn film, anything, any way they wanted. They felt it was their God-given right because they had paid for it. We talk about choice. Some say I had a choice when I walked through that door and up those stairs, but it wasn't my choice to be beaten, raped, and sodomized so many times every day. There are so many stories I could share from the sex trade. I could write a novel, maybe even a Netflix series, that would make 50 Shades of Grey look like a fairy tale. Tonight, I am here to share with you my truth, my story, my experiences as a vulnerable coloured woman in New Zealand, to share with you the journey of a young girl who had grown up believing exploitation, rape, abuse, and violence was a normal way of living. Sex work is a glorified term for paid rape. Those men never paid me for my time or my company. They paid to fuck me in every single hole they could find, even when I said no. Getting fucked 20 times or more a day is not work. This is terrorism against women. A sustained international attack on vulnerable women, girls, boys, and children. They may not blow up buildings or themselves, but they blew up my mind, my body, and my soul. They sent me to a torture chamber that I would never escape from, because even today I fight to survive, to live, to feel worthy, to be loved, and to dream. Today, I still experience flashbacks, as though I am back in those rooms. I suffer from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, body dysmorphia, sleep disorders, weight problems, health problems, dental problems. Until recently, I still drank to forget, to cope, to manage. I have terrible self-esteem and self-confidence, and I question my abilities every moment of every day. And I hate being alone. Being alone terrifies me the most, because this is when I am transported back to the days of prostitution. I can feel the buyer's breath in my ear, on my neck, and on my skin. This is when I can hear them repeatedly telling me how worthless I am, unlovable, useless. I never sleep with the light off. It always has to be on, so that when my eyes open, I am instantly reminded of where I am and that I'm safe. I hear women saying that paid rape brings them empowerment, feeds their children, gives them a home. I hear them speak as they protect the only road they know, the only life they know, the only life they have lived. I see them because I too was once them. Once the woman who protected my normal and the only life I knew, the only life that supported my children. I am grateful that they have their voices, their loud, strong, beautiful voices. But I am here to speak for my sisters who have lost their voices, who don't have the strength to speak, who have lost their fight, along with their belief and love and humanity itself. I am here to speak for the children who, from as young as 9, are being sold on the streets of Auckland, and who, from the age of 12, are being sold in licensed massage parlours. I am here to speak for the women and children who are the vast majority. I am here to speak for them, the most vulnerable in our society, in our communities, the ones who go unseen and unheard. Look, this is my story, and I don't speak for everyone in this trade. Some may have been lucky enough never to experience this form of violence, and sadly, some may have experienced much, much worse. In Australia and New Zealand, Indigenous, Maori, Thai, and Pacific Island women and girls are enormously overrepresented in the sex trade. I'm here to speak out for the vulnerable, for the lost, for the weak, for the majority with no voice, for the majority that are too scared to speak up. New Zealand would like you to think they have the perfect model, but they do not. I know this because of my experiences, my sister's experiences, other women and children's experiences who have lived under the full decriminalisation model and before. Since New Zealand's Prostitution Reform Act was passed in 2003, street prostitution is worse than it ever was before. Children as young as 9 are being pimped out on the streets by gangs, relatives, and even family. Children as young as 12 are being sold in licensed brothels. Sex tourism is happening in New Zealand today. 20 years this year since the Prostitution Reform Act was passed into law in New Zealand, and it continues to fail women, particularly Maori, Pacifica, and Indigenous women, and those experiencing poverty, homelessness, family violence, and domestic violence. Full decriminalisation has normalised violence against women and children. It has enabled and encouraged violence against women and children rather than reducing it. It is well documented that violence against Maori and Pacifica women and children is increasing, and it's only getting worse. Since 2003, New Zealand has seen a huge increase in both domestic violence and rape. Research shows us that up to 80% of Maori and Pacifica women will experience family and sexual violence in their lifetime, be beaten and killed by their partners at the highest rates in New Zealand. Those from our most vulnerable communities and cultures are less likely to go to police for fear of reprisal, not only from pimps, but families who may be linked to crime, for fear of losing their children or their homes. We have heard stories from survivors that due to there being no support services or exit services to support them to leave, they have no choice but to stay and endure the abuse. An article by a local media outlet in New Zealand, and this is recent, interviewed University of Otago researcher Claire Weinhold. She shares that women currently in the sex trade report that coercion, violence, and financial exploitation remained in brothels. Women are commonly reported being coaxed into accepting bookings, often justified by operators on the grounds of professionalism and profit. One woman recalled a situation where the manager's coercive behaviour played out in front of potential clients. She has made a booking for you, which you may or may not want. And then it's very difficult to get out of because she's like, he's paid. He's already waiting for you, she said. And she will be right there in front of the customer saying all of this. So it starts you off on the wrong foot. She's like, what? Why have you got a problem seeing this client? Another woman described being booked by a client who looked like he wanted to punch me in the face. However, when she wanted to decline the booking, she was told, but he's paid, babe. A shift supervisor and the woman interviewed by the researchers said it had long been accepted that they would just take whoever came our way. Women will not say no because it loses everyone money. Owners of brothels and managers downplay violent, coercive, exploitive situations. Many women also observed that security cameras were most frequently used to monitor and discipline them rather than ensure their safety. Even where cameras had captured images that could help with pursuing charges against a client, managers did not seem particularly interested. Mostly cameras were used for monitoring the women and for disciplining them. There have been instances where brothel owners would watch the cameras and complain to the women if he saw them turning customers away. Her research also highlighted financial exploitation of sex workers in brothels. Direct fines were endured in some brothels, disguised as business-related fees, and some women reported managers holding their money until the end of the week or a day that they had designated to be payday. More frequently, women described coercive behaviour as a form of financial exploitation that was often reasonably subtle, with managers pushing workers to accept bookings that they would rather not take. Ripley, who was a manager as well as scene punters in the brothel, said, I had had conversations with managers where I've said, you know, it's 3 a.m. and I've had 6 clients. I'm done. I'm gone. And then the manager has gone, no, your shift is till 6. So no, you will meet them. And then you go, no, I'm not going to meet them. But they make you meet them anyway. And they make you do it. They push you. Prostitution in New Zealand is not safer for women. We are seeing many articles coming out week after week. In my own personal email account, I am alerted whenever a media article is released in New Zealand in regards to the sex trade. My email is filled with over 300 alerts of media articles in New Zealand related to violence, coercion, exploitation, trafficking, and children in the sex trade in the past 12 months. Only recently, an ex-national member of parliament who faced multiple allegations of sexual harassment and bullying when he was in parliament now owns and runs an escort agency in New Zealand. Already this year, he has had some of the women in the agency come forward with concerns for their own safety, welfare, and their working conditions. It has been reported that vulnerable young women working for this ex-national member of parliament are being left traumatised and fearing for their safety. Some of the women are as young as 18. They have told their support person of being left alone in apartments across several unmonitored locations without any adequate safety protocols or panic alarms. They have reported client assaults and intimidation without any follow-up or support for their physical or emotional well-being. And that these punters had been able to book again even after they mistreated the women. These women feel unsafe and unprotected with nowhere to turn and were unlikely to report it to police. Katwa, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Australia, and Wahine Toa Rising created a booklet called 16 Myths of the Sex Trade. One of our most common myths is that sex work is safe if it is fully decriminalised. And I'm going to read to you some of it now. It is argued that the sex trade is safe if it is fully decriminalised, yet this is not the case. And the experiences of women in Aotearoa, New Zealand's sex trade post-decriminalisation are evidence of this. Since full decriminalisation in 2003, under the Prostitution Reform Act, violence and sexual assault within prostitution have remained, and some women have even died at the hands of sex buyers. A report by Aotearoa, New Zealand's Prostitution Law Review Committee, noted that women in the sex trade were still vulnerable to exploitative employment conditions and that there were reports of some sex workers being forced to take clients against their will. The report went on to note that the majority of women interviewed felt that the PRA could do little about the violence that occurred. This same report also refers to the sexual assault that women are routinely experiencing in prostitution as adverse work experiences. The risk still inherent in this decriminalised sex trade is underscored by advice offered by the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective document, Stepping Forward. Stepping Forward is a booklet, just to let you know, that they put out for women in sex work. It states, when dealing with violent clients, the document advises make as much noise as possible to attract attention. Try calling fire. A passerby will probably pay more attention. If you wear a whistle around your neck, blow it in his ear. Decriminalisation promotes women and girls as objects to be purchased, fuels men's entitlement, and contributes to society misogyny. A society that enables this is not safe for any woman. In contrast, the Nordic equality model, a system which has been adopted by Sweden, Norway, Israel, Canada, Iceland, and Northern Ireland, Ireland and France, decriminalises people selling sex and supports them to exit the sex trade. It also criminalises sex buyers, pimps, and procurers, and aims to inform and raise awareness about the harms caused by prostitution. As women, we deserve better than a system that normalises men's sexual entitlement and abuse of us. Our future generations deserve better than a system that normalises the buying and selling of women and children. Sex trade advocates say that women have a right to choose what they do with their bodies. Therefore, it is only right we ensure that all women in the sex trade have real choice to begin with. And this is why exit services are so crucial. This is something we don't have in New Zealand due to full decriminalisation and that mindset that prostitution is work. The preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes freedom from fear as an important right. Therefore, regardless of law, it is essential that countries provide funded services to give women and young people who are being sexually exploited in the sex trade a means to safely exit and to live free from fear. Leaving the sex trade is as difficult as leaving a violent relationship. A majority of women in or exited from the sex trade experience PTSD, regardless of if they've been in the trade for a day or years. Just as some women fight for their right to engage in the sex trade, we fight for the rights of the women who have been coerced, trafficked, forced, groomed, and raised into it. I find the courage within to speak up, because I know if I don't, then only one side of truth will be heard. That voices of women and children who go unheard, they need to be heard. As a survivor of the sex trade in New Zealand, I note it is important and imperative that all women's voices are heard when making changes to any legislation. Women in the sex trade seek full decriminalisation in the hopes that it will bring safety, well-being, workers' advocacy and rights, and less stigma. However, New Zealand has shown that as shown in recent media articles, as well as with women's voices who are currently in the sex trade, and research, that stigma, violence, and coercion is still as rife in prostitution in New Zealand as it was before 2003. It is well known, as I've said, that women find it difficult to leave violent domestic situations, and that leaving is the most dangerous time for women in those circumstances. Leaving a commercial situation is no easier, and in fact presents many additional barriers to women who wish to exit the sex trade, including the fear of reprisals from multiple people, including violent criminals and organised crime, rather than one former partner. Shame and stigma, which can prevent women from accessing government financial support in the usual way. A lack of confidence and trust in dealing with government agencies. Potential complications in terms of taxation and other indebtedness arising from the informal nature of many financial arrangements within the sex trade. Social, educational, emotional, and mental health problems exacerbated by all of the above problems that can make it difficult or impossible for women to get the support they need, if any is available. Just as women have support systems in place to exit violent relationships, so too must exploited women and children have support systems to exit violence in the sex trade. In New Zealand, all these issues remain in place despite the current full decriminalised status of the sex trade. There is no specific provision for assisting women to exit in New Zealand. Section 18 of the Prostitution Reform Act states that a refusal to work as a sex worker does not affect its entitlement to social security. However, many women in the sex trade are reluctant to engage with government agencies. Funding is provided through the Ministry of Health to the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. They are the only agency that receives funding targeted to the sex trade, and its purpose is limited to personal healthcare and support services purchased directly by the Crown, including mobile surgical services, telephone and online advice services, hospice services, sexual and reproductive health services, and services associated with the implementation of the oral health and cancer control strategies. The New Zealand Prostitute Collective's website states a number of purposes for the organisation, but the only mention of exit services is as follows: to provide support to people under the age of 18 who are involved in sex work, to ensure that they have a variety of options, are able to make informed decisions about these options, and that these options include the ability to leave sex work. It is plainly apparent that the NZPC's primary purpose is to promote the engagement of women in the sex trade. The term sex worker includes all people engaged in the sex trade, including pimps and brothel owners. There is no service in New Zealand apart from Wahine Toa Rising, which we founded in 2019. There is no other service in New Zealand apart from us that advocates solely for the women and children involved in the sex trade. We are still a fairly new organisation. Women over the age of 18 who wish to exit the sex trade are essentially left alone by the government to find the means to do so themselves. We at Wahine Toa Rising believe that any government that is willing to decriminalise and thus give legitimacy to the activity of purchasing sex from women and young people by men, especially while recognising the violence and other disadvantages that women and young people are subject to as a result, is also responsible for ensuring that any woman or child who wishes to exit the sex trade must have free and immediate access to the best quality, fully funded, wraparound exit services that it is possible to provide. Sex work advocates say they have a right to choose what they do with their bodies. Therefore, it is only right that governments with the power to make these decisions make sure that all women and children in the sex trade have choice to begin with. Hence why it is so important to provide exit services. Regardless of the decisions, it is essential that provisions for exit services to provide vulnerable women and children who wish to live free of the sex trade have the opportunity and the choice to do so. In summary, if countries adopt full decriminalisation, they send a message to women and children that violence is okay if men pay, and that slavery is a job like any other. Full decriminalisation only benefits those who profit from the buying and selling of women and children and will increase all forms of violence against them. Full decriminalisation discriminates against those who are most vulnerable. However, it does not discriminate when it comes to children. Women in the sex trade will not be safer. In fact, full decriminalisation will only put them in more harm's way. Vulnerable women and children deserve to live a life free from fear, torture, violence, and slavery, not just a few, but all. If countries adopt full decriminalisation, they send a message to our vulnerable women and children who are trapped in the sex trade that their lives don't matter and can be sacrificed for the few who feel empowered by being bought and sold for sex. If we stand to the side and let our voices stay silent, we will set a precedent that women before us who fought for us to live a future free from fear with equality and freedoms, we say to them by staying quiet that their voices, their fights didn't matter. It is up to us to unite together and fight for what is right. It is up to us to show other women and children that we are all important, that we all deserve to be free, and that we all deserve better than being bought and sold for sex. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you so much for your story. It's very difficult to listen to. I'd first of all like to ask you a few specific questions, but before that, I'd like to know how you exited this world. How did you come out of prostitution? That's my first question for you. Thank you.
I came out of prostitution because I wanted to come off the drugs and the alcohol. That was my big thing. And I really wanted to try and fight to get my daughter back. So I rang an organization in New Zealand at the time called the Salvation Army. And they put me into a hotel to detox from alcohol at the time. And my body went into alcohol withdrawals, and I died pretty much. And that was, I guess, how I didn't exit at that time, but that was how I guess the seed had been planted that I didn't want to be in that life forever. But it was a process, because I guess like an addiction, I didn't have any education, no skills, no job. So I kept going back. So I'd leave and then I'd go back, and then I'd leave and I'd go back. And it wasn't actually until I moved to Australia that I left.
And how old were you when you finally left prostitution?
I was 30.
I think it's really important to highlight something that you said. Experts also underline this as well, and that's that the majority of the women that are dragged into prostitution have a childhood background of sexual abuse. Do you think that this also affected you and your entrance into prostitution? Do you think you were more vulnerable? How did you feel? Did you connect with your childhood experiences when you were in prostitution?
I definitely think because of my my childhood sexual abuse that made me more vulnerable to being drawn into the world of prostitution. I often refer to it as a way, I guess, I was groomed, to believe that was all I was worth. I often think that if I'd had more opportunities, that maybe I would have had, I don't know, and if I'd had more opportunities and more family support, and there were more services there to, I guess, prevent, do a lot of preventative work, maybe I wouldn't have gone into that life. I mean, if I'd had a home and I'd had somewhere to live and I had support and I had people who cared and loved me, and then I don't think that I would have been vulnerable to that life in prostitution. And I think that's why it's so important that we, it's not just about women exiting prostitution, it's also making sure that women are supported before they get into prostitution. If that makes sense. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yes, of course, I understand perfectly. And I think you're so strong and so resilient. As you said in your testimony, not everyone is able to exit. Not everybody has the help that you received from that organization in the very beginnings of your exit. So I also wanted to ask you, because of course at the school we work with survivors and we like to focus on the key teachings that we can take from leaders such as yourself role models of abolitionism. So I'd like to ask you if you've received any therapy, what importance that's had on your life psychologically. We think that it's very important to offer this kind of ongoing support after exit. So could you talk to us about your psychological therapy that you might have received?
Because I've got a whole, that's a whole nother book. I was in and out of, I don't know if you call it psychological therapy, gosh. I was in and out of mental hospitals when I was in prostitution. So I think because of my past, I would, I drank a lot and I was on a lot of drugs. And so there was a lot of times I'd get arrested and then they would put me into, these high security mental hospitals. Those things are not so good. Don't put anyone in those. But I haven't had a lot of psychology since then. A lot of the work that I've done is I've had to do on myself through personal development, talking with, other organisations that I've met now. I do have a psychologist now, however, who is amazing, incredibly patient. But yeah, I think psychology support is so important, but it's complex. It's really, really complex. And I think that if we're going to support women, they really need to be, and I say it a lot here in Australia, we need psychologists who are really trauma informed around exploitation and sexual abuse. And I don't know what it's like for you guys in Spain, but here in Australia, you get one psychologist and they're all exactly the same. No one really has a specialized field in different traumas, or in some cases we don't have a lot who are specialized in any trauma. But I always say they really need to be trauma focused. It's hard, but we definitely need. I don't know what the answer to it is. I just feel like psychologists for survivors, they just need to be really specialized and focused around that trauma that women experience in prostitution. Does that make sense? I don't know if I make sense, but.
Yes, I understand perfectly. And of course, at the school, we work with survivors. And I work with a team of psychologists that are really important actually to the work that we do. And I always ask them to be very careful when they're working with survivors. There's something that I'm particularly aware of, and that's PTSD, post-traumatic stress. And I'd be interested to know what you think. Once you've discovered what your trauma is, what your stress is, how do you deal with it? When you're in a situation now, when you relive this trauma, are you able to recognize what's happening? Do you think that it's possible to work on this and to find tools to save yourself in these situations?
It's such a good question. It's absolutely it's absolutely possible to recognize and improve, I guess. It's hard. For example, I remember when I first started speaking out about my story, and I would be so triggered. I would grab a bottle of red wine, or 2 or 3 or 4, and I'd just be a mess. And I would get stuck in my past for months and months and months. Whereas now, I can recognize those triggers and I know how to keep myself safe now, I guess. So now I know that if I'm sharing my story, I need to make sure that I have support around me. I need to make sure that I have someone that I can talk to. I need to make sure that there's no bottles of red wine anywhere at all, only water or coffee. So yeah, I've put systems in place for myself that keep me safe from those triggers. So I think it's absolutely possible to heal from the trauma, not necessarily forget, but definitely to heal. But it takes a lot of work. It's not an overnight thing. It's hard work and a lot of commitment and perseverance, and yeah, it's tough. It's hard. Yeah.
Well, but it must be interesting as well to see how you grow, how you advance, and how you mature in a way. And your experience can also serve other women to take that path that you took, the path of resilience that in your case has actually become true leadership. And I wanted to ask you a few questions now. About your testimony before we give the floor to the students who have some comments and questions that they would like to make about your braveness and about the truth that you share in your testimony that actually goes against the New Zealand model. In New Zealand, there are about 5 million inhabitants, as far as I know. However, I haven't been able to find data for gender violence in New Zealand. I do know from your testimonies and testimonies from other women like you that you have some of the highest statistic rates in violence against women. And what we do know, all those of us who work with this subject, is that in those places where prostitution is legitimized and legalized, there are sexual violence indexes which are really high. Can you tell us about other types of violence that women suffer in New Zealand?
So all the types of violence. I get family violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, rape, strangulation. I think it's, yeah, there's lots of violence that that women and children experience in New Zealand. There are statistics there. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I'm happy to find them and email them through to you. There are statistics available on the domestic violence and family violence rates in New Zealand. I think also Nordic Model Now, the organisation Nordic Model Now, they actually have an article with all the statistics and the links of where you can go to get them on their website. But I will definitely email those to you. Just send me a reminder, or in an email, send me a reminder. Family violence in New Zealand is really, really, really high, especially amongst the Maori families. It's due to poverty, crime, dependencies, alcohol, drugs. New Zealand has a lot of criminal organisations over there. I actually said to someone, if you really want to get a really clear idea of how New Zealand and the cultures over there work around family violence, there's a movie called Once Were Warriors, and there's 2 movies. It is very raw. I'm just going to put it in the chat. It's very raw, but if you want an idea of how family violence works in New Zealand, this is a really good movie to watch. It's another level, the family violence in New Zealand.
Thank you. And another question, you mentioned how prostituted women were killed. Do you have data for prostituted women who are killed by pimps?
Yeah, there's a website called Sex Industry Kills, and they have New Zealand stats on there for the New Zealand women that have been killed since 2003. From my recollection, it's 8. The majority of them are Maori or coloured women. But yeah, that's probably the latest one is, and I talk about her a lot, is Bella Tapania. She was a young woman that was murdered in Christchurch. She was a young mum, and she had tried to exit the sex trade several times. She'd tried to find support services, help to exit, and there was no help for her. And then this one time she went back, she was murdered. So she's someone that I think about quite often, because I think if we'd had the Nordic model or the quality model in New Zealand, she would be here with us today, because we would have had those support systems in place for her. So yeah, she's.
Yeah, and you also mentioned another phenomenon that actually happens in Spain as well, which is the very close link that exists, because obviously pimping is a kind of organized crime, and there are very close links to drug trafficking and to the selling of drugs in brothels, or through the actual prostitution, consumption of prostitution, because very often, at least in Spain, pimps make women sell drugs. Is that something that happens there as well? Is there a very close link between these two? So between pimps and organized crime related to drug trafficking and laundering and everything related to drugs and to that kind of organized crime.
Yeah, I think it just goes hand in hand anyway, doesn't it? Recently we had an article in New Zealand where there's quite a bit of homelessness at the moment in New Zealand. So an organisation had put women and their children into a hotel, and one of the criminal organisations in New Zealand actually went to the women and told them to sell the drugs for them, and when they refused, they were prostituted, and if one of them refused, she was raped in front of her children, and that's only recent, so that's just this year. We've also heard stories of young girls, underage young girls, 12, 13, who have come to the city, run away from home, and been recruited by criminal organisations to sell drugs. And then when they've spent the money or they've taken the drugs themselves, they've had to prostitute, they've been prostituted to pay back what they owe. And then you've got the other, there's like a whole range of them. So you've got like, the ones on the lower end, and then you've got, I guess, the high class criminal organizations, or the ones that do all the money laundering and the casinos, and, they want to build the huge big brothels like in Germany. So yeah, it's all linked. I think, yeah, everything's linked.
Yeah, and I would like to ask you a last question to also connect with the first part when I introduced you, or to link with that introduction. There was something that drew my attention that I even found tragic, because I read an interview that we did with you at the abolitionist school with Corina Fuchs, who is your friend, and you're in touch. You said during that interview, and I already knew because you had already told me, but you said in that interview that when in your country the criminalization of prostitution model was debated, it was only won by a vote. Could you tell us about this? Because I think this is terrible. It was just by one vote.
Yeah, so it was just one vote. I don't know what much more there is to tell. It's really, really frustrating because I think I feel like if there'd been more voices back, I mean, I wasn't fighting for against full decriminalization or for Nordic back then either. I mean, I was still in my trauma trigger stage, I suppose. But I think if more people had been speaking up against, full decriminalization, we probably would have had the Nordic model in New Zealand. And I'm not sure why. I think from what I hear, and I can only tell you from what I heard, but it was looking like they would that full decriminalization wouldn't be voted in, and then it was just the very last minute one of the members changed their mind and went the other way. But yeah, it was only one vote. Very. So it just shows how important it is that every voice is included and every voice is heard. And just be that one person that makes all the difference.
And this is really the very last question, because I want to thank you personally for your support here in Spain to manage to get that law against pimping passed. And in addition to the Socialist Party MP who was in June when you were here, there was also an MP from a right-winged party, Marta González, and both of them, Andrea Fernández and Marta González, committed in front of you, as you were there, all of the survivors that were there, that they were going to make sure that this law was passed. But as I said at the beginning, this law is in danger of not being passed. But this is a very important opportunity because pimping in Spain is getting a lot of attention right now. So I wanted to ask you, what would you say to MPs from both sides, left-winged and right-winged, to convince them to pass this law? Seeing as you obviously have the experience from your country and you know what happened in your country and what the depenalization has turned into.
Oh my goodness. What could I say? I could say so much. so much. Yeah, it's hard. I think the biggest thing that I guess when it comes to full decriminalization is full decriminalization will increase violence in your own communities, and this is what I said to the members of Parliament here in South Australia and Australia, and I said to them, can you honestly tell me that you can go home right now and stand in the middle of your primary schools or talk to your children or your grandchildren or your nieces or any child, any little girl or little boy, and can you honestly say to me that you can go home and say, get down on one knee, look them straight in the eye and say to them, today was a great day. Today we voted that it is a man's right to buy your body. And if you can't do that, then don't go full decriminalization.
Bueno, en este caso es que lo que no se va a aprobar es la ley abolicionista, ¿sabes? Lo que están impidiendo es que se apruebe, porque se supone que en España es un modelo alegal, pero no es así. Tenemos un lobby proxeneta muy fuerte. España es un estado proxeneta e incluso las supervivientes lo consideran la Tailandia europea, fíjate. Entonces, me gustaría, si te parece, que le demos voz al alumnado, a las preguntas que tengan. y yo después voy a hacer algunos comentarios que te hacen a ti, ¿no? A ver, vamos a las preguntas de las personas que están del otro lado. Siguiente pregunta. ¿Cómo podemos acompañar en el camino de la recuperación a una mujer prostituida? ¿Qué tipo de apoyo emocional necesita, según tu experiencia?
So for me, I've always said that anyone who's leaving prostitution needs to have a safe space. So I think it's really important that they have a safe space, maybe a refuge, a safe house, a healing retreat, where they are fully supported holistically, like wholly holistically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically. A lot of these women, may not know how to cook, may not know how to budget, may not know how to look after themselves, may not even feel worthy enough to look after themselves or be looked after. So they need so much support from so many different people. Not just one person, not just a psychologist, but a social worker, a therapist, other survivors who have been through it, who can support them and be that beacon of hope. We need more stories from survivors who have come out of the sex trade and now are doing amazing things with their lives, because I think if we have that hope that, oh my goodness, that person's been there, they've been through what we've been through, and now look at them, they've come out the other side and they're living life and they're doing amazing. If they can do it, I can do it. So we need more hope.
Gracias. Hay otra pregunta muy
Thank you. There's another question, which is very interesting. This is from Belen. She's asking, what's the difference between the German model and the New Zealand model?
So I can't answer that question because I have no clue. I think it's, I don't know. For me, I think it's the same, but I'm not, I honestly could not answer that question for you because I don't know. I think it is the same. I just think that our countries are two different sizes, and I don't know. I have no idea. Sorry.
Bueno, se están animando muchísimo con las preguntas,
We're getting more and more questions, and this is very interesting. Nuria is asking, what do you think us teachers can do in the classroom in this sense?
So how do you mean? I think I need a bit more clarity.
Cuando dan clases en educación para los niños,
so when they teach, when they're teaching children at school, for example, what could they do to tell them about this subject?
¿Cuál es el papel de un maestro, de un profesor o una profesora?
What will be the role of a teacher when it comes to raising awareness about this subject? What would you recommend?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. How old are the kids? Oh, look, I've got kids. I have 9 children and I have 2 grandchildren. I'm not a teacher, but I think I'm always educating my kids, not around the negative. I'm always educating them on how to keep themselves safe. But I also think it's really important when it comes to our kids that we're teaching them and reaffirming to them how beautiful they are and how strong they are and how they can do anything they want to, and just, and I can't even think of the words at the moment because it's, it's 3:30 a.m. in the morning here and I think my brain's starting to fade a bit. But I think when it comes to kids, it's just really, really important to make sure that we're always reaffirming to them how beautiful they are, how intelligent they are, how unique they are, how incredible they are. Because if they have that self-confidence and that self-worth and that hope, they won't ever become victim to prostitution.
Hay un comentario muy interesante que lo hace una compañera,
In comment here in the chat from a
que
male
se llama Omar desde
colleague
Uruguay,
from
Cono Sur,
Omar in
América del Sur,
Uruguay,
¿no?
in South
El
America.
problema que tenemos en América Latina,
He
que
says
yo
that
vengo de allí, soy de
there's
origen
a big
argentino,
problem in Latin
es
America.
que
I'm also from that
no
region. I'm
tenemos
from
tampoco
Argentina.
posibilidades de
And
acceder las mujeres
a big
a campañas de
problem
prevención
is
y
that
sensibilización.
women
Son países pobres, azotados del sur global.
are not able to access programs to help them, and they're very poor countries. There are very little anyway. So the question is about civil society. What can civil society do to prevent sexual exploitation and trafficking?
Well, for starters, we need new laws. That's for one thing. I think, we really need to fight for the equality model in all countries, because that model itself just teaches, it just educates. And I think that's the big thing, is education. It educates people that, that prostitution is violence against women, and it puts all these systems into place. That women are not prostituted and trafficked. I think it's hard, because in poorer countries, New Zealand's the same. There's pockets in New Zealand that are third world war countries. There's a lot of poverty. In Australia, up in the Northern Territory, we have families up there that we call the long grasses, and they literally live in long grass, no shelter, no running water, no toilets, nothing. They just live in these long grasses, and they're prostituted a lot. The white man comes along, picks up the Indigenous woman. They call themselves the resource gatherers, because the men give them food, clothing, shoes, stuff for the kids. It's so hard, and it breaks my heart, because sometimes I just wish I had a magic wand and I could just give everyone a home and give everyone support and make sure all the kids were educated, because education is such a big thing. But then when you don't have the resources, or they don't have that access to education, I don't really know what the answer to that is. I'm sorry. I think that's something that I'm asked myself a lot every day, is how do we support the poorer communities?
Well, I have a message from Amelia Tiganos, our colleague. She is a big role model here in Spain, a survivor, and I think you met her last year in this event involving the parliamentarians. Anyway, she says you are the best. And she also asked me a question. She wants to know how you came across abolitionism. Tell us about this first contact.
Oh yeah, when I first shared my story, it was quite by accident. So I had left a really violent partner, and a friend of mine had said to me, "Oh, can you run this domestic violence rally for me?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, sure, why not? I'll run it." And it was at this domestic violence rally that I heard a young woman speaking about her experience in prostitution. And I remember standing there and saying to myself, what is she talking about? What does she mean prostitution is violence against women? I don't understand, because I'd never, ever heard anyone share their story about prostitution. And after I spoke with her and shared with her my story, She invited me to Melbourne, and that was the first time I shared my story. But I remember all these people standing outside where we were talking, you know, like no to Nordic model, yes to full decriminalization. And I remember saying to someone, what is that? What is full decriminalization and what is Nordic model? Because I'm not political. I mean, I was in the sex trade and in prostitution, but you'd be surprised how many women in prostitution have no idea what law is what, or what the name of the law is, or even what it means. But it was from there that I got introduced into abolition. But you know what? I fought for abolition without even realizing that that was what I was fighting for, because there was no name. For me, I didn't know that there was a name. It wasn't until someone talked to me about Nordic model that I went, oh my goodness, isn't that what I've been saying the whole time? But yeah, it was quite by accident.
Well, so you feel that you always were abolitionists from the beginning, even if you didn't know what abolitionism was, you suddenly realized later on. I'm going to, I think, end the session a little bit early today. It's almost 4 a.m. for Ali Marie. So I'm going to just select 2 final questions. And I know our students will understand and be grateful, of course, to you, Ali Marie, for joining us today and for sharing your story and your wisdom. We're learning an awful lot with you this evening. So let's choose 2 last questions. And I'm sorry, students, we can't ask Ali Marie all of your questions. But let me see here.
Graciela, you can send me their questions and I can answer them. So if there's a lot of questions, I'm more than happy to answer all the questions that I can. I can just, you email me them, I'll send you back the answers.
I thank you so much. That's really sweet. Thank you. We're gonna, of course, stay in touch. I'm gonna ask you about those films that you recommended and those myths. So, and we'd love for you to visit Spain again as well one day. Now, there is one very interesting question here in the chat. It's asking about advice to fight against sexual exploitation through national police, for instance, state police. What could they do to help?
I think, you know, I think there is a lot of it is networking and connecting with people. So I think you will find that there are a lot of police who are unhappy or who want to see things change. Because, I mean, look, the other ones you deal with, a lot of the women who are exploited are probably more often than others. But it's finding the right police who are willing to talk to you about it, because I think, you know, at the end of the day, some of them are quite political. But if you find the right one, then that will, that'll trickle down for the rest of them. But it all comes down to connecting and networking and talking to people. Look, the more conversations you have with people, the more support you're going to attract. So, you know, just keep talking to people and don't give up. Just be really persistent. Sometimes you just have to bug them. And then when you're just talking to them all the time, eventually they go, you know what? We're just going to hear what she has to say just so she goes away. So just be persistent.
Yes, and I also think, I don't know what you think, but we should include women in security forces, because many survivors say that victims feel safer around women. Because women, generally speaking, don't pay for sex, and they're less easy to corrupt than men. There are studies actually to prove this. So do you agree? Do you think it would be good to have more women working in security forces with victims?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really important. Women are also more empathetic, understanding, supportive. They a lot of women can come across as more kind as what men do than men. And I think women are less intimidating. I think that's the big one. They're just not as intimidating, and I think women feel a lot safer around other women. But then in saying that, that can vary. I mean, my sister is quite the opposite. She's quite petrified of women because of the upbringing that she's had, and she actually feels more comfortable with men. So she prefers a male therapist. She has a male psychologist, and she gets terrified around women. So I think it's really important that we have, I guess, that balance of, men and women, and to make sure that we cater for everyone and their needs.
Vamos a la última pregunta y después voy a hacer una despedida, que quiero hacerte una despedida en forma.
Let's move on to the last question now, before we say farewell. Montserrat asks if you have any data to do with disabled women, and if they are more vulnerable to being prostituted in New Zealand. Do you have any percentages about prostituted women that have a disability?
There's not a lot of data out of New Zealand. So NZPC and the government have been quite skillful, I guess, in making sure that not a lot of data gets out. So no, I don't have any data at all on disabled women in prostitution. However, I think not just New Zealand, but everywhere, disabled women are absolutely more vulnerable. But then when we talk about disabled, we're also talking about women with mental health disabilities. So just not physical disabilities, but also mental health disabilities. So that's the majority of women in prostitution. So, yeah.
And let's not forget that there's a high percentage of women who have mental health problems because of prostitution.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to say goodbye now. We want to thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your generosity, your kindness, for being so honest. The thing about survivors is that you're so strong and brave that it really sends messages that are hard-hitting, things that are probably quite hard for you to talk about. So we're so, so grateful for your testimony and for your support, your political support in favor of the Nordic model. And I really hope that soon Spain will have an abolitionist law. I would also like to thank those people that allow us to work at the abolitionist school, Atlas Free. You know some of the colleagues there, and also the SIBA in Santa Coloma. If you remember, that's where our headquarters is based. We're going to send you the video of this chat today if you want to upload it to your website. It will be interpreted in Spanish and English on the recording for those who haven't been able to watch it live. It will be online next week. So for now, it's farewell. And I hope that your message in favor of the abolitionist model will reach New Zealand one day. I would also like to thank Hazel and Yolanda, the interpreters today, and apologies for the technical problems early on in the session. If you would like to listen to the start of the presentation again, we will make sure that the recording is correct. So thank you again, Ali Mary. We will let you go to bed. Please rest and see you next time. We hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.